Hi there. Welcome to the first in a series of online video lessons intended to provide you important principles and handy tips for the study and practice of argumentation. In this first introductory video, we want to make sure that we have a clear understanding of first principles. If we're going to engage in effective argument ourselves, or if we're going to analyze and evaluate the arguments that are made by others, we need to know what we're talking about. So this video is intended to provide a definition of argumentation and argument. And in order to do that, we need to make sure that we understand a couple of important related ideas. First of all, the two primary senses of argument that folks refer to when they use that concept. And secondly, the basic building blocks of any argument. These first principles are going to lay down a helpful foundation for the rest of the stuff we're going to talk about in this course and this video series. So let's get started. When we're talking about argumentation, according to the scholars Inch and Tudor in their textbook Critical Thinking and Communication, argumentation is defined as the process of making arguments intended to justify beliefs, attitudes, and values so as to influence others, as well as the study of this process. Now, there's a couple of important things in this definition, besides, of course, the circularity of argumentation being about the process of making arguments. That, of course, makes us wonder, well, what is an argument? Hang on. We're getting there. But there's a couple of other important things in this definition we want to think about. First, the notion of process. That when we're talking about argumentation, we're not talking about something that is a one-shot, over-and-done activity. But argumentation is actually an ongoing, dynamic process of communication. And we're going to talk about exactly what that means in subsequent videos in this series. The second important thing in this definition is the idea that argument is about justification. So the third part of the definition is about influencing others. That's the notion of persuasion, convincing others to accept a point of view that we're offering. But it's important to note that what separates argument from other kinds of persuasion is this second element. What makes argument argument is the fact that we are engaged in a process of offering a point and then supporting it in order to provide valid, rational reasons why you should accept this position. So essentially, argument is inherently involved in persuasion, but not all acts of persuasion are argument. And we'll, of course, flesh out what this means in subsequent lessons. So if that's argumentation, and we know that it's the process of making arguments, well, what are those arguments? Well, this is where things need to get a little nuanced, because we refer to the concept of argument in at least two important ways. These two primary ways of understanding argument were articulated by Dr. Daniel J. O'Keefe. Currently, he's a scholar of communication at Northwestern University, and he developed this concept back in 1977 when he was working at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. By the way, he was a great professor for communication theory, in this humble instructor's opinion, just saying. Anyway, Dr. O'Keefe establishes a clear distinction between two ways in which we use the concept of argument. Argument 1 versus argument 2. Now, what's the basic difference between these? Well, when we're talking about argument 1, we're talking about a specific communicative act. Someone constructs and presents a specific argument. So if you use a phrase like, she made an argument, that's referring to argument 1. To illustrate this concept, let me take you back to 2016 and a clip from The Daily Show with Trevor Noah. The host is interviewing Tommy Lahren, a conservative pundit recently of the Blaze satellite television network.
What is your biggest issue with Black Lives Matter?
I think, and I've said this many times, it started with good intentions. I think it was well-intentioned. The moment that they started pushing hands up, don't shoot, which is a false narrative, proven time and time again to be a false narrative, the minute that that became their slogan, the minute that protesting turned into rioting and looting and burning and militant actions, that's when I lost respect for Black Lives Matter.
Now, while argument 1 is a specific single communication act, argument 2 is understood by Dr. O'Keefe as an interactive exchange between arguers. This is part of the social process that was alluded to in our earlier definition of argumentation. If someone uses the phrase, they had an argument, argument 2 is what they're talking about. This is the kind of reference to argument that you might refer to if you're having some kind of exchange with a friend or loved one or a professor or just somebody on the quad. So to illustrate the distinction between argument 1 and argument 2, let's see what happened in the interview between Trevor Noah and Tomi Lahren after her initial argument 1. What you'll see is a back and forth process of exchange in which one person makes an argument that reacts to the other person's argument, and so on and so forth. So this is argument 2, argument as social exchange.
Okay, but now here's my thing. Let's address each of these things one by one. When you go protesting turning into rioting and looting, that's not a Black Lives Matter phenomenon. That is what happens when there is a protest a lot of the time. There were people who rioted and looted when teams won in Chicago years ago. It doesn't mean that they are now bad people. That's what happens. There are some bad people in every instance. Going back to Black Lives Matter, though, for you to say that, you say they have good intentions, they had the good intentions. How are you labeling out the actions of a few and condemning an entire group? I don't understand that.
They subscribe to the Black Lives Matter movement. They say, we are the Black Lives Matter movement, fry 'em like bacon, F the police.
These are a few people. These are a few people. This is not the Black Lives Matter that is not the platform, though.
I saw it in my city of Dallas. I saw what a Black Lives Matter protest looked like. And I saw 5 fallen officers because of it. So
that's not fair, and that's true.
No, it is fair, Trevor, because the shooter said, point-blank shooter said he's doing this because of Black Lives Matter.
Yes, and there are many things you can say. I mean, if you go outside, you can say anything about doing something because of, you cannot deny that the man had mental issues as well and he was in a tough place. Just because you say the thing doesn't mean it's what it stands for, right? Because you're the same person who argued on your show that just because Donald Trump has supporters from the KKK doesn't mean he's in the KKK. So it goes against that argument. It goes against that. You can't say he did it because of.
No, but the shooter said,
yes, but Black Lives Matter has never said go out and shoot people. I'm saying you're saying this to your audience.
So, bearing in mind that the term argument can refer to both individual acts of communication, argument 1, or interactive social exchanges, argument 2, what we see in both of these examples is the same basic definition at the core of what we mean by argument. Here's how Inch and Tudor define argument. An argument is a set of statements in which a claim is made, support is offered for it, and there is an attempt to influence someone in a context of disagreement. Now, we see some similarities with our definition of argumentation that we had at the beginning of this video, specifically the attempt to influence someone. So it's reinforcing for us that argument is at base a persuasive act. Now, of course, remember, it's not just a persuasive act, but it's also an act that's engaged in justification. So what we also have in this definition are the basic building blocks of any argument, or at least any argument 1. We'll have a context of disagreement, and within that context of disagreement, someone is going to offer a claim, someone will provide evidence that's intended to support that claim, and finally, someone will provide reasoning that's intended to provide a link between the evidence and the claim in order to justify the position that's being offered to the audience. Let's break these components down in a little more detail. When we're talking about context, we're talking about elements of situation, occasion, knowledge, beliefs, values, events, actions, history, material conditions, language, etc. that surround and inform any act of communication. Context is an amazingly important element of any communication, as Obi-Wan Kenobi observes.
The Force is what gives the Jedi his power. It's an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us and penetrates us. It binds the galaxy together.
Okay, so he's discussing an energy shield that we'll find out many years later is constructed by midichlorians in the bloodstream, whatever. But the analogy is really helpful. Context is something that informs not only how anyone engages in an argument, but also how anyone is going to receive an argument. So context is generally important, and we can think about the context of disagreement as something that grows out of the confluence of arguer, question or need, and audience. In other words, the arguer has a specific intent as well as specific ideas and experiences, etc., that they're bringing to the argument situation. The context itself provides some kind of question or need, a reason why people are engaged in argument in the first place, and that's going to be something that motivates the arguer's goal. And the context is also going to include an audience, the audience being the object of the arguer's persuasive intent, and the audience themselves are also bringing to the table a whole host of experience and knowledge and so forth that are going to inform the way that they process the argument and whether or not they're convinced by it. So how can we see this illustrated in the video clips from the Trevor Noah-Tomi Lahren exchange that we just saw? Well, let's drill down into Ms. Lahren's argument. The context that all of this argument takes place within involves a number of important elements that would give us some understanding of what it is they're talking about and why they're talking about it. So at this point in 2016, among the many elements of context that could be informing this argument include racial tensions in the United States being a very salient point that's driving the news media coverage of a variety of events, as well as the public conversation. In particular, we have a number of high-profile examples of police officers engaged in harassment, violence, and in some case, even shooting deaths of unarmed Black citizens. And this racial tension in the United States has led to a social movement by the name of Black Lives Matter that engaged in a bunch of high-profile protests across the country. And these protests not only got high-profile media attention, but they also received a fair amount of backlash from folks who were opposed to or perhaps challenged by what the Black Lives Matter movement was talking about. In addition, in 2016, we have an important presidential election that resulted in the unexpected election of President Donald J. Trump. That election was followed by a number of high-profile protests across the country, many of which were tied in some ways to issues of race and racial tensions, based in part due to some of the discourse coming out of the Trump campaign that year. And of course, these protests themselves received a fair amount of backlash from conservative Trump supporters across the country. So we have all of this stuff informing the arguments that are taking place between Lahren and Trevor Noah in this interview. So that's the context of disagreement. What happens next is an arguer offers a claim. Put simply, a claim is an expressed opinion or conclusion that the arguer wants presented. This is the point that an arguer would want the audience to be persuaded by and convinced by. And subsequently, this opinion or conclusion is something that the argument is going to have to justify. So in the case of Lahren's argument to Trevor Noah, at one point she makes the following claim. Black Lives Matter is an illegitimate social movement. She wants to make the case that Black Lives Matter is something that should not be taken seriously and in fact is worthy of opposition. Now, in order to have anyone accept that claim, Lahren's got a bit more work to do. That's where evidence comes in. Evidence are defined by Inch and Tudor as facts or conditions that are objectively observable, beliefs or statements generally accepted as true by the recipients, or conclusions previously established. In subsequent videos in this series, we're going to drill down into the nature of evidence, the different kinds of things that can constitute as evidence, and how they operate in the structure of a larger argument. But right now, what we need to know is evidence is the supporting material that's being used to ground and justify a claim. So in Lahren's argument, in order to support her claim that Black Lives Matter is an illegitimate social movement, she provides as her evidence that Black Lives Matter protests across the country have escalated into acts of violence. But notice that claim and evidence themselves don't completely constitute a complete argument. What we need is one further piece, and that piece is reasoning. Inch and Tudor defined reasoning as something that constructs a rational link between the evidence and the claim and authorizes the step we make when we draw a conclusion. This is sometimes referred to as an inferential leap between the evidence and the claim. In other words, what we need to do when we look at the evidence and the claim offered by Lahren is we have to ask ourselves, if it is true that Black Lives Matter protests have escalated into acts of violence, what is it about that fact that would make Black Lives Matter illegitimate as a social movement? And some of you might be thinking to yourselves right now, well, of course it's illegitimate, and here's why. It's that move itself that provides the reasoning. And in many cases, reasoning is going to be something that is left implicit and unstated in an argument because the arguer knows that the audience is going to be able to fill in that inference. We're going to talk about this concept in more detail in subsequent lessons in this series. Right now, suffice it to say that the reasoning that Lahren provides, albeit implicitly, but something that Noah and the audience can pretty easily figure out, is that social movements that endorse or support violence are illegitimate. And indeed, at one point in the argument, if you remember, she does say at the onset that she thought positively of Black Lives Matter initially, that it was a protest movement that had good reasons for doing what they were doing and seemed legitimate. But when it got to the point that it escalated into acts of violence, then it engaged in conduct that are illegitimate as a social movement. And that's when Black Lives Matter lost her support. So we can see how Lauren's argument 1 is constructed within the larger context of racial tensions in the United States, the specific controversy regarding police violence toward Black citizens, the Black Lives Matter social movement, the 2016 presidential election. Within all of this context, she establishes a claim that she wants to have accepted by her audience. She provides a supporting fact, evidence, in order to support that claim, and then she implies an inferential leap, providing reasoning that connects that evidence to the claim in a relevant manner. So the way that the argument is going to operate is that if you accept the evidence as true and you accept the reasoning as sound and cogent, then the claim ought to be true. We can also see how the same context of disagreement gives rise to the primary argument that Trevor Noah makes in response to Tomi Lahren's argument. So in his response, you'll note that Noah makes the following claim: that Lauren's argument that Black Lives Matter condones violence is illogical. And in order to have this claim accepted, Noah provides his own evidence. Individuals that engaged in the violence that Lauren's talking about said that they supported Black Lives Matter, but they were not endorsed by the movement. Trevor makes a big point of emphasizing that these were individual actors that expressed their support of the movement, but the movement did not call for violence. The movement did not support the actions of these particular persons, especially the shooter of police officers in Dallas that Lauren makes a big deal about in her argument. Noah's reasoning that connects the evidence to the claim is actually expressed pretty explicitly by Noah in the argument. He makes the point that persons or groups can't be held responsible for the aberrant actions of others. And in order to back this reasoning, he makes an analogy. As you may recall, he points out that the Ku Klux Klan, the infamous national racist hate organization, endorsed Donald Trump for the 2016 presidential election. And Noah makes the point that at an earlier point in time, Tomi Lahren herself made an argument that just because the Klan endorsed Donald Trump doesn't necessarily mean that Donald Trump supports the beliefs and the actions of the Klan. And so Noah takes this earlier argument from Lahren and turns it back on her, providing the reasoning for his own claim. Just because these mentally ill and otherwise problematic individuals engaged in these acts of violence does not mean that Black Lives Matter is responsible for these acts, that Black Lives Matter supported or endorsed or wants further acts of violence to continue. Notice in this final example that we have examples both of argument 1 and of argument 2. Trevor Noah is making his own specific argument, argument 1, that is intended to refute an earlier argument 1 that Lahren made earlier in the interview. So this is an example of argument 2, where Noah's argument 1 is responding to Lauren's argument 1 as part of an ongoing argumentative exchange. And not only that, but Noah is actually basing a big part of his argument on an earlier argument that Lahren had made at some other point in time in the larger context of disagreement. And so argument 1 and argument 2 are going to be interacting with one another in a fluid and dynamic process of persuasive communication. And that's a great example of how argument works in our public sphere. So what you really want to make sure that you get out of this lesson are at least 3 important things. First of all, remembering that argumentation involves both justification and influence. Persuasive influence is always a goal of argument, but it's not the case that all persuasive acts are argument. A persuasive act is an argument only if it involves justification for the claims or conclusions that are being offered. The second point you want to get out of this lesson is that arguments can be both singular acts of communication, argument 1, as well as interactive social exchanges, argument 2. And finally, you want to remember the primary building blocks of any argument, comprised of claim, evidence, and reasoning, all of which are constructed within a broader context of disagreement. If you have any questions or concerns about this lesson, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'd be glad to clarify whatever you need. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video.